Okay, follow up to spraying and a little bit of talk about base coats. I haven't mentioned this before, but I'm sure a lot of you do it. Just a little buffing cloth for matte coats. No point for anything other than a matte coat, because matte coats are a little bit different. Some go on pretty smoothly. You're not really going to make out the texture too much there. And some can do with a bit of a rub down. They collect a lot of overspray. And the problem with spraying further layers after that overspray is on there is that your surface sort of gets rougher and rougher. So it's quite a nice idea to have a cotton type cloth. I just cut this piece from something that I've got, but it's a little bit small, cut bigger. And I do often, and you can see how much comes off, and that sort of gives you a satin finish. It's not quite a satin, but anyway. Right, so I sprayed that gloss grey, and I just want to make a few comments about that because inevitably there will be questions. So that type of spraying is a somewhat larger flow surface spraying. So I cover fairly quickly, but you do need to watch. There's a lot of learning process involved in getting the consistency right, because if you don't get it right, you can get runs almost immediately. But once you know your paints fairly well and you know exactly, so when I mix it in that bottle and you flick it up against the sides a little bit, you judge the strength of color against the sides. Within 1 second of it running down, let me rephrase that, as you flicked it back and that color runs down, it's not even a second. If it's watery and you're not seeing color, that's too thin. If you've done that and it sticks up there and you're seeing color for many seconds, that's way too thick. So it splashes down against the side and you get to know that thickness of color for when you're using a bottle. For when you're using top feed, that's up to you to learn to judge that. I don't use that except for fine camo spraying, and I almost never do fine camo spraying. As I did say, I generally don't do German schemes, and on the occasion that I need to do a fine line spraying, then I'll pull out one of my other airbrushes. You also sort of get to know how much you need to put in that bottle. So what I had in that bottle was a fair bit. I covered not large things, not like whole aircraft, but I sprayed quite a number of smaller to medium parts. And it sprayed really, really nicely, and it'll dry now for a day or two. Some of those parts that I sprayed are the color that they will be, being the inside of intakes, the looking down the jet nozzle, and some of them, like the outside of the vanes of the nozzle, that gloss grey will be a base coat for an alclad color. The sliding part, and I just can't remember what it's called, and I think it's a sliding part on the Phantom as well, the flat plate by the intake, which on some aircraft has got a cone, a supersonic cone that moves forwards and backwards, but I can't remember the name of that plate. That is possibly probably going to get oversprayed by the aircraft color or not, or it'll get a metallized finish and it'll be its own independent piece, depends on what I'm doing there. But since I was doing those areas, I might as well do it all. So that's all of the intake areas, which means that on the other Phantoms I can now get to gluing halves together, get those intakes on. I didn't do the other nozzles because I haven't cut them off, so I will still do that. Now, yes, okay, let's address that part quickly. Do you have to cut them off? Can you not just spray? Yep, you can. I was spraying slightly high pressure, which it wasn't really high pressure, but it wasn't low pressure. That's what I mean. With low pressure, you can spray down into a tube and not get much blowback. In which case, you can put your airbrush right in there and get a sort of an even coverage. I don't really like that style. But is it worth me cutting off the nozzle? Well, I'd say yes, because now I can do dry brushing and I can do a wash inside those veins of that what they've presented as the part, that end part of the engine. So it's not a big deal for me to cut that off. It's pretty easy to do so, and it's like I say, it's fairly deep in there. You're not even going to see the cut-off mark. Have I used the correct color for the pipe? No, and no one's going to see that or care. I'm going to make the little veins at the end of the engine look somewhat acceptable, so that if you looked down into the engines, you'd see something that looks interesting. I could paint a metallizer down the jet exhausts, but I'm almost after a look that doesn't draw attention to the intakes or the exhaust whatsoever, hence the dark grey. It must just look nice, but not be a matte. A matte is a bit too much for a jet aircraft like this. So that's why I went for that. And depending on the amount of effort - accuracy that I wanted to put in a particular aircraft, I would adjust my choice of color to be more or less, well, more accurate. I think, okay, so, right. So that was the gloss grey, straight onto gloss plastic, which works for some paint types. It generally does work for Humbrolls. That was an extra color, somewhat similar to a Humbrol. But I did want to talk a little bit about base coats. So there was no base coat, or if you want to look at it slightly differently, the gloss grey is a base coat to an alclad on the areas where I choose to do alclad. But let's say we're not even talking about alclads. When do you actually use a base coat and when not, and what type of base coat? The very first consideration is the color. So if I'm doing a model which has different colors, let's say a matchbox, the strength of color of something that I'm putting onto there may not be adequate enough to cover both colors equally, both plastic colors or 3 plastic colors equally. Let's say they use a white and a black and a green plastic colors, and I'm spraying a certain color which doesn't have high color coverage rate. I'm not going to get an equal finish across those colors. This dark gray has great color coverage, which means I would be getting just about the same result no matter what I sprayed that gray on. So if you're doing light colors, white, yellow, light grays, light orange, creams, reds, light greens, light blue, any of the light colors are not going to have great coverage, color strength coverage, which means you'd have to go base coat first to even that out. A mid gray is normally the thing that's chosen, but if you're sitting with an aircraft which was already a nice mid gray, then you don't particularly need a base coat, unless, point number 2, the specific color scheme calls for something that requires pre-coats, like let's say this. If I was talking about one of my Harvards with Dayglow on it, Dayglow orange, Fireblaze, whatever, there's numerous of them, or other fluorescents, don't do anything good by just spraying them without prep work. So Fire Orange or Fireblaze or Dayglow Orange needs a strong orange base or a strong yellow-orange base. Actually, I'll even rephrase that. They need a strong yellow-orange final coat onto which you do the final day glow. But orange, yellow are not good enough to spray onto other colors like dark gray plastic. They need something else to make the orange strong. So there you need a white or a very light color. You'd get away with a very light gray as well, so that would be an option. So the order of events for a day glow orange might be light gray, yellow orange or yellow orange mix, day glow orange, and then a clear coat. I have done in the past even a base coat, then a yellow, then the orange, so that the orange takes a strong orange stance off the yellow, and then the day glow onto that orange. Now you can get different day glow effects by doing day glow onto yellow, onto bright yellow versus onto bright orange. And that depends on the type of aircraft that you're trying to replicate, the type of color scheme, because not all day glow oranges are produced equal. There are helicopters and rescue aircraft with interestingly different day glow oranges than what you may see on a South African Air Force Harvard, or even the bright orange on a New Zealand Air Force Harvard, which is a different day glow to the South African type. If you're doing a vehicle which has got an interesting bright color scheme, you need to pre-plan your base coats. Okay. If you are doing a military vehicle or something that is not high gloss, then your base coat can be a satin to a matte. You can even go matte base coat. If a very heavily weathered look is what you're after, the amount of matte that you have present at that point is not going to matter. And there, as long as you're using a base coat which helps what you're doing moving forward after that. On this tank, which I showed earlier, there's no particular choice of base coat to help anything other than let it be a darker one, since the overall impression of this particular tank is not a light look. And I would say that to help you with that shadow effect in a lot of your recesses, you might as well go for a dark base coat in that case. But it really all depends on what you're looking for. So if I do the Matador truck, I would be looking at a dark brown to dark grey, dark brown grey, because I want a little bit of effect of semi-old, which the brown will give, but I don't want it to actually look brown, but I don't want it to look clean, bright grey like what I was just spraying on the Phantom. That isn't really helpful for age of the truck. So, and it also depends, do I want to produce a freshly restored truck in its nice colors, or somewhat well used, decades old? That Land Rover, that little Land Rover which I'm busy on, I've done that in a brown because that's got next to no further detail. So all there is base coat and then final coat and a little bit of weathering and so on. As I do them, I'll do the Land Rover and the Matador somewhat together, and you'll be able to judge the difference in techniques. Now, I was also asked, or someone was mentioning, when I was talking about the weathering on this, and I think that's worth actually talking a little bit about, not only this, but larger, the same sort of thing could be addressed for larger wings, 1/48 wings and so on, things like that. One tends to get a little bit stuck in the fact of weathering is what happens to go into panel lines or a wash or that type of thing. So when I address something like this, if I just start doing something, I'll inevitably just mess it up. There has to be a vision of what you want to do and a vision of process. So I'd need to look at pictures and get an idea of what, and so far I've semi got that idea. I know what medium I want to use. Oils was a choice, and the reason I'm not going for oils at this stage is because I may want to do multi-layer weathering, and oils is going to affect further layers being oil-based, plus I don't want to wait for long drying time. So it will be stuff that is dry very quickly and can be manipulated. Inevitably, I would say we're talking about 3 layers of weathering here with different effects. It's not just a case of putting on something and rubbing it randomly down. The idea that I have at this stage is a heavy whole sponge, those random shape sponges. But I don't want a very strong effect. This is not a let's say an armor piece, which, although I'm just thinking, well, you're not exactly going to get that on armor either, but we don't want it to look like Swiss cheese when we're finished here. All we want is a little bit of variation, and especially not man-made look. We want random elements weathering. This boat may have been on the sea, it may have collected barnacles, they may have been cleaned randomly. So I know more or less what I'm going to use. I know the medium, I know the application, I just don't know whether the result is going to be suitable enough for a first layer of weathering. I do know that I'm going to do it fairly thinly, because it is highly likely that I'm going to need to be doing multiple different things, including some sand, a little bit of sanding to reduce the effect of whatever I've done on previous weatherings. My point with that in saying is that when you're dealing with something that is somewhat of an unknown, practice first on other things. So I'm going to have to get a sheet of plastic, whatever, take my sponge, test this out. If I mess it up, let it rather be on that piece of plastic. If that's not working, I need to rethink the ideas that I have. Maybe start with another choice of weathering before I do that. Now, this, I can't really take a paintbrush and do flow line type of weathering like you might think is common on an aircraft, where whatever you were going to do, let it be in the line of airflow, because that's sort of what happens on a vehicle that's always traveling in air. This vehicle is not, this boat is not traveling fast on anything, which means there's no such thing as a flow line. At best, the ship spends 99% of its life standing absolutely still, which means what you're getting is just the difference in waves splashing and the collection of crud from the waterline just being at a certain point for so much of its life, the deterioration of paint, sun bleaching. So practice on random stuff. I'd say one almost needs more paint mules than what you think you should have, or at least pieces of styrene plastic. I do have quite a number, and I do spray practice and weather practice on them, but probably not enough, not as much as I should. I should do a bit more even, and I will do for this. So we'll have a look at that. We'll see what I can come up with, and we'll judge what might actually work on there, because there's nothing worse than actually doing a process on something and you've absolutely just gone, you've gone to the point where you're not happy and you need to redo the thing, and you don't want to redo the thing. I've seen a number of guys that then want to go and take all the paint that they've put onto a model off and start again. I did that a number of times as a kid, but honestly, brake fluiding or taking paint off models these days is I've got to really want to do it. It's not annoying. Like when I was doing the restoration of those, I'm still doing, but the restoration of those 1/12 motorbikes, there I'm doing it, but there's a very specific purpose. I'm doing a restoration. When you were trying to complete your model, you're not trying to do a restoration. Suddenly changing your model to now be in a restoration state from being almost finished is a whole mental change of approach, which is not necessarily worth it. This one's just waiting for attention, actually. The green that I sprayed on there just happened to be some leftover from whatever I was spraying, and I thought I'll just put it down as some part of the base coat. It's not to say this thing's going to be remotely green. It's not. And that amount of base coat is meaningless on the overall scale of this aeroplane. This is one of those models where I'm also just open to doing something different. I don't particularly need to produce an XL in any meaningful or accurate scheme. I might. We'll see. Yes. Comment about these ones. So I wouldn't. This one's really strong. This will just crush a model. But these little bits, and I forgot to say that when I was talking about it earlier. I think Carl said he glues bits of sandpaper on there. Remember, I was demonstrating by putting it onto a wing, and perchance it actually stayed on, but I was expecting it to slide off, and it does slide off mostly. The other thing you can do is just put a little bit of something sticky, almost a double-sided tape, but of course then it is, you want it to be mildly tacky. You could put a bit of double-folded Tamiya tape. That would actually work. Make a little loop of Tamiya tape with a sticky on the outside, put one piece there, put one piece there, and it'll hold on for a while. Even this one, to be honest, the only place that I'd be putting these on is right at the edge where you're forcing the plastic to touch plastic, because as soon as you're pressing the open area, you're just going to squish whatever open. I don't use that often. Not at all, but they are very handy. On the radio-controlled aircraft, I use them far more. Okay, so add any further questions or comments about the base coat. The only other thing that I can think to say at this stage is sometimes a gloss coat onto gloss plastic doesn't adhere as well, which means that further work on that particular area might not be as stable as you'd like it to be. This particular paint is really good, and in general Humbrolls are pretty good. Spraying a gloss acrylic onto a gloss coat, I'm not as convinced that I'd be as successful. Far more likely to get runs, but I use Humbrolls far more, so I'm way more in tune with how they handle. People that use acrylics way more will be way more in tune with what happens there. If you're doing something that you want to prepare yourself for better adhesion, then I guess a satin base coat is what you're looking for, knowing that it is going to unfortunately undo a bit of the glossiness of your final coat, depending. A lot of people are saying that the lacquer coats do pull very nice and tight and glossy. I've got a few lacquers, and here and there I'll try them. I personally find that the oil enamels, these Humbrolls and extra colors and whatever else that I spray, oil-based enamel paints, have got a very, very good color pigment, as opposed to some other paints where I put them in and yeah, it's not bad, but it's the strength of color just isn't there. Okay, comments and we'll chat. Cheerio.